Okay, we're here with Dan Opensheen. You were in Afghanistan for quite some time. Why don't we just start off and ask how long were you there, and why did you go there?
We left in January 1991, and we were there until July 2009, so just 18 and a half years. But we also came back every 3 or 4 years for 6 months, what we called home assignment. And the reason, at that point, it was just my wife and I, and we had a 1-year-old daughter. And the reason we wanted to go was we just saw the need of many countries, developing countries, decided that, yeah, we wanted to go to Afghanistan. And so we left with a 1-year-old and 1 child and came back after 18 and a half years with 4 children.
And how did you help the Afghanistan people?
Well, we were there to provide assistance for them. And the NGO that we worked with provided assistance in 3 areas: medical, education, and development. And so I had more of a development background. My wife is a nurse, so she worked on the medical side. She worked first of all in a hospital that took care of burn children, and so she would provide care for children of all ages that had been burned.
Now, you were in Afghanistan. Where specifically? What are some of the specific places that you were in?
Well, we lived mainly in 2 areas. We lived in Kabul for the first 2 years. Then we moved, when fighting became so intense in Kabul, it became unsafe for our family, for the children particularly. So then we relocated up to the town of Mazar-e-Sharif and lived there for 5 years. And then when fighting became bad in Mazar, then we relocated back to Kabul, where we spent the last 12 years.
So the fighting subsided, and that's why you went back to Kabul?
Yes, and the government took over. The Taliban eventually took over and provided security.
So when you're saying fighting, you're not talking about American conflict?
No.
This
is fighting between the different ethnic groups and the different Mujahideen groups.
Now, when you saw this fighting between the Mujahideen and this other group,
well, they were all Mujahideen. They were just different Mujahideen
Yeah, so it's like a
groups.
civil war.
It was a civil war. That's what they call it.
Did you still feel safe during this experience, or was this pretty intense for you?
Well, it was intense, but generally the Asian responsibility to provide hospitality and to protect visitors and guests is very strong. So while we were there, even though fighting may have been going on, fighting was not directed at us. We were never threatened per se.
So as Americans, you felt safe?
We felt safe in the fact that we didn't think that we were particularly targets.
Okay.
You could be someplace at the wrong time and have a rocket land close to you and you could be injured, but they weren't necessarily targeting foreigners. In fact, many times the Afghans protected us when one group would go in and take over another area. There would be some looting of the areas, and we actually had Afghan neighbors who stood in front of our gate and said, these are foreigners, they're here to help us, you don't go in and bother them. And so they complied and left us alone. But all of our neighbors' houses were looted, but we were not bothered.
Let's fast forward. You experienced Afghanistan with the Soviet puppet government. You experienced Afghanistan with tribal civil war kind of warfare going on, and then a group called the Taliban, and coming in. What personal stories do you have of that transfer of power?
We were in Taliban-controlled territory. When the Taliban took over the north, we were in the north. Fighting erupted. We were able to evacuate out. We evacuated to Pakistan, and then the Taliban would not allow foreigners into the north for a number of months. And during that period, we relocated back to Kabul, where we lived for the remaining part of our time.
So the Taliban has taken over. Nervousness in Afghanistan? Was there a sense of we're not safe here, but we're still going to help some of these people out? What was
Well,
that?
the Taliban were not as happy with. The Taliban wanted to turn Afghanistan into a religious country, an Islamic country. And so oftentimes many of the Taliban would see Westerners, particularly Europeans, who they considered all to be Christians, to be a threat to that establishment and to the success of their desire to turn it into an Islamic country without any influence from the West. And so at times, yes, we did feel threatened.
Do you have any specific stories you care to share?
Well, again, the Taliban were not just a cohesive one unit. There was actually probably 5 or 6 different Taliban groups that were from different regions of the country, which some were more strict, some were more liberal, some were very moderate. But the leader of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, was a very conservative Pashtun Taliban, and he followed a very strict order of religious codes and different things. They also, in order to fight the Mujahideen, they also brought in what we would call mercenaries from other countries. So you had people from Saudi Arabia. That's how bin Laden got into Afghanistan, because he was invited to bring his fighting experience into Afghanistan. He came in to fight alongside the Taliban against
Some of these other tribal groups.
Yes,
No,
and against the Russians as well, because he came and went even during the period when they were fighting the Russians.
Now to clarify, would the Taliban call themselves Mujahideen?
No, they would call themselves Taliban,
Okay.
which means a religious student.
Okay, so they're a specific group in there.
Yeah, they usually what you could think of them as going to an Islamic school or seminary. You wouldn't use that word seminary, but it's a religious institution where they learn to read the Quran, to memorize it, and the rules of living as a Islamic state.
Okay, so you're 96. Did you know who bin Laden was in 96?
We heard names,
Okay.
but in fact, he only lived a few blocks away from us when we lived in Kabul at one point. He had his Kabul residence just 3 blocks from us. You knew,
So
you
you
heard
knew-
of him, but he was, at this point, he wasn't a threat. He had not done anything against America in 96, or no, in 97. And so there wasn't, to be living next to him, we didn't feel the same way. After 2001, if we had lived next to him, we would have been a lot more worried about it. But we knew of him, but he wasn't the concern that he was.
Osama bin Laden wasn't saying in Afghanistan, while you're there, we gotta get rid of all these foreigners and we gotta kill them and we gotta do all that.
No, nobody did that
Okay.
so much. Although there were Chechens and other groups that were there as mercenaries, the Afghans, as I said, had a real strong sense of hospitality. They were there, we were there as their guests, and so they took care of us. Chechens who were there as mercenaries, some Saudis who were there as mercenaries, some Moroccans who were there as mercenaries, did not see us as being guests. They saw us as being a negative influence to this newly Islamic country, and they didn't like us there. And so we had more trouble with these mercenary groups.
And
than we
because
did.
of those mercenary groups, did you ever feel your life was
Well, yeah, I was threatened with guns several times by them, although they never carried it out. I thought there was once that they would have, I was close to being killed by them, but they just eventually, when they realized that they were trying to intimidate me. When they succeeded, then they backed off.
right, trying to show who's boss here.
Yes.
Now,
it was
you're
1
talking.
against 12, so it wasn't much of anything I could do except back away.
Right. So you're talking about the Taliban being strict. You were living in Kabul. Give some story. Give some things that you saw about them being strict.
Well, the Taliban did not permit girls to go to school. They did not permit a woman out on the street alone. She had to have a male relative escorting her, whether it was a brother, her husband, father, or even a son. Children were not allowed to play with kites or other forms of games.
Why is that? Just because it was too much
It was
fun?
frivolous. They
Okay.
should be studying.
And what would they be studying?
Well, they would be studying the Quran. They would be memorizing it. They don't read it and understand it. They memorize it. The most Islamic, well, all Islam says that the Quran in the Arabic form is God's word, and just memorizing it is important. Although they don't understand what they're saying, they can repeat things. It'd be like me learning German or another language and just memorizing it.
Because it's in Arabic.
Because it's in Arabic.
And they don't, that's not their native
It's not
tongue.
their native language, and they don't actually learn to translate it. All they know is how to memorize it and repeat it and to recite it.
So is this fair to say that largely for the Afghan Muslims, they're reading from a book, they have no idea what it's saying?
The ones that can read it, yes, they can read it, but they wouldn't know what they're saying unless they've actually studied Arabic and learned to translate.
So is this Islam, would it be fair to say that the religion in Afghanistan is more of like an ethnic, cultural thing, or is it really like...
No, they follow the tenets of Islam, but they have religious leaders who tell them how to do it. And of course, they know the basics, the 5 pillars of Islam, what it takes to be a Muslim. You have to follow 5 pillars of Islam. They would know what those are. They would know what the basic phrase is. If you say Allah Akbar, they would know that means God is great. They know the basics in the Arabic language. To take the Quran and read it and understand it, only a very small, 1% would be able to do that because they've studied Arabic. They're educated.
Right. So what are, you said women aren't allowed to go to school, can't fly kites, can't have fun like that
Yes.
sort of thing.
Well, the kite flying is not the kite flying that we think of either. Kids get out here and they fly a kite between themselves, just to fly a kite. In Afghanistan, when you fly a kite, you're actually battling 2 kites and you're trying to cut the string in the winter. And so the Quran says there's no gambling. You can't gamble. The reason they would say kite flying in that sense is because you're gambling. You're trying to win over somebody else. And so they would say that is bad. Music, you couldn't have any music unless it was religious music.
What about instruments?
No instruments. Everything is done vocal.
So you're
And no
living.
television.
You're living in a city that women are not educated. You can't have. Women are not educated in schools.
Girls are not going to school, but there were educated women. Women were not allowed to work.
And that's because of the past.
They were taught in the past. They were no longer able to work. Teachers, 80% of the teachers were women, so they were no longer able to work. So therefore, the schools generally closed because there weren't enough teachers to teach even the boys.
And this is all in Kabul,
Well, this is all over the country.
all over the entire country.
Wherever the Taliban control.
Yeah. So, could they walk out in public alone?
Not alone.
They had to be escorted.
They had to be escorted.
Now, could your wife or could your daughter walk alone because they're not Afghani?
Yes, they could, because they were not, under the Taliban, all Afghan women had to wear that head covering from about age 10 and up. And so they did, and so my wife, she would wear a simple headscarf just to cover her hair, but she didn't cover her face. And so the Taliban wanted Westerners to dress differently so they could tell who was who.
Okay.
So she could walk out, although usually she would still take a child with her. Having a daughter or son with her sort of gave her respect because she was a mother.
Okay.
And in fact, sometimes the single women on our team would borrow our children to escort them just so that they would not have any trouble. And it helps to have a child with you.
Because some of these people tasted freedom to some extent before the Taliban was there. Did you see cases where people tried to protest, revolt, and say, "We're not going to do this. We're not going to follow your rules"? I mean,
Yeah, we did see that, but the Taliban were very strict, and they, in fact, enforced it brutally.
how did they enforce it?
Well, they beat them, oftentimes to death.
Now, would you see that?
We would see people getting beaten with clubs or with steel cables, knocked unconscious, dragged away, and then never heard of again.
So the Taliban's in power, and we talked about the rules. We talked about the laws. Is there even in the midst of that? Are there things that you loved about Afghanistan? Why not go home?
Well, one, people needed help, and we were there for the people of Afghanistan. We were not there for the government. We were there for the people. So, and we had oftentimes people say, please don't leave, because when you guys leave, things are going to get worse. And they were talking not just about us, but about the foreigners in general. They liked the fact that we were there. They felt somewhat protected by that fact. But they also knew that we were providing medical assistance that would not be there if they didn't. My wife and her co-workers, they ran the only clinic for women throughout the whole city. So if they closed their clinic, then women would not have any medical care, because male doctors, which were 90% or 95%, would not be allowed to see women. So we had women doctors who were foreigners, and they would treat women. So if they closed up, then they wouldn't have anything else. And so we were there to help people. And we also had very close friends. Our Afghan co-workers and stuff were very close friends, and so we were there. We came back for them as much as for anybody else.
Okay, so tell me the difference.
Well, the difference was there was music. You could hear all over the city. People were playing music. You saw girls going back to school again. People were laughing where they weren't supposed to laugh in the streets out loud. Television was going on. You had computer shops opening up. So you had a lot of, it was totally different.
So no one's crying over the Taliban gone.
No.
Did
In fact, we had one man come up and, George Bush, Bush. And we said, what? Bush? George Bush. He saved us.
Yeah. So and you would feel that prosperity, progress was occurring in Kabul? Was there fear of the Taliban coming back?
At that point, no, they thought Taliban had been completely immobilized, and nobody expected them to regain any sort of power. And
so is there fear in Kabul?
Yes, I think generally there is a fear among people, what's going to happen after the Americans leave, after the British and other NATO forces leave.
And that's probably going to be this year.
At the end of this year, at the end of this year, they're not supposed to have any troops actively pursuing or engaged in the Taliban. They will be there to advise, but they won't be, the fighting will be left up with the Afghan
And
national.
so you rub shoulders with these people. They have music, they're happy. Are these people willing to die, willing to fight to keep the Taliban from going?
Well, that's a good question, and that's what people don't know. I understand that a third of the Afghan army deserts every year, and they have to replenish a third of their army every year. So there is a lot of people who aren't willing to fight hard enough to keep the Taliban out. I've heard that that's a statistic. I don't know if it's true or not.
Now, you were saying earlier when we were talking that, back to the Taliban, I want to mention this, that there were some Taliban that supported you in the sense that they wanted you there. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, like I had said, there were different groups of Talibs. Some were moderate, some were more strict. The moderate ones saw the Westerners, the foreigners there as helping them in this government and their country. So they did want us there. Other groups only saw us as a source of into their strict society, and they didn't want us there. But the foreigners remained. That even the government never asked foreigners to leave. It was more individuals who did not want us there. Generally, during the Russian military activity, it was not as technologically advanced as Americans, and so the Russians would carpet bomb. They would get a lot of big aircraft and just carpet a whole area and just carpet bomb it. And that's what when after 9/11 the Afghans were afraid it was going to be a similar experience where the Americans would just come in and carpet bomb their villages or wherever just to get rid of the Talibs. They quickly learned through laser guided missiles that the Americans were very precise. And so many of our Afghan friends said that they would sit on the roof and just watch because they knew that they weren't going to get hurt because they were going after specific targets. And because you did have special forces directing those laser guided missiles, and they were in there, and it was very accurate and very little collateral damage.
Now, did you see any of that stuff happening?
By the time we got back,
Yeah,
it was all finished.
Okay.
But unfortunately, they've had more collateral damage recently. They've had wedding parties get hit by a missile. But a lot of that, I think, is just misinformation from one informant who didn't like somebody, and he could say, there's Al-Qaeda in that village, when there, in fact, there wasn't, and the military may not have as accurately substantiated the facts before they sent in an aircraft or whatever. So part of that has happened.
Okay. Well, I guess let's close out with one final question. We're breaking in two. One, do you see yourself going back? And two, where do you see Afghanistan 5 years from now?
Do we see ourselves going back? Well, not in the near future. We came home for family reasons, and we're here for several more years. And we definitely want to see what's going to happen after 2014 or 2015 with the pullout of American military. Is the government going to be able to protect itself? So we'll wait, but we wouldn't be leaving that early anyway. We have kids still in college, as well as one going into high school next year. So we've got some time before we would have the freedom to be able to go back. But we may also look at other areas of the country that other of the world where there might be needs. So we're not particularly tied to Afghanistan, but we do see ourselves going back overseas in the future somewhere. Now, what's going to happen in Afghanistan, that's the million-dollar question. Everybody's asking that, and nobody can answer it. So there, it just is whether or not the Afghan National Army is going to be ready. The government, the American military leadership says that they will be ready. They are getting ready, and they will be ready.
We'll see.
We'll have to see.
All right, well, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.